What happened to the good old days when reporters were yucking it up and talking and laughing?
Well, I get caught on the YouTube early and have
Oh,
all that.
that's right. Like I said, I tell people all the time, I could never do the job these days. That's so foreign to how I used to do it.
Good afternoon. I'm Dave Boxam. I'm a Public Information Officer with the Minnesota Department of Public Safety. Glad you're here today. Glad you could be here in person, and we'd like to welcome those who are also joining us online. So it's a big day today. Today we're going to talk about safety. We're going to talk about safety on the roads. We're going to talk about safety on the water and on the trails due to cannabis legalization starting next week. Helping us out this week, or helping us out today to talk, we have Commissioner Bob Jacobson from the Department of Public Safety. We have Colonel Matt Langer, Chief of the Minnesota State Patrol, Mike Hansen, Office of Traffic Safety Director, and Colonel Rodman Smith with the Department of Natural Resources. Once we're done talking, we'll open it up to Q&A, and I just ask that as you're asking your question to identify yourself and the organization that you're with, due to people online can't necessarily hear the questions and such, and also just as courtesy as the folks that are up here. So with that, we'll get underway. Commissioner?
Yeah, thank you so much. Again, as mentioned, my name is Bob Jacobson. I'm the Commissioner of Public Safety, and it's my honor to be here today with all of you. 1 week from today, the use of recreational cannabis will become legal. And one message we want to make sure that's clear, our message here today is that driving high is a DWI. And I repeat that, driving high is a DWI. Here at the Minnesota Department of Public Safety, we're committed to working with our partners to make sure that Minnesotans have accurate information to keep themselves safe on the roads, waterways, and trails. Along with the messages that are going to be shared with you today, people will have access to a question and answer document on our Office of Traffic Safety webpage. Please, when you have an opportunity, take a look at that. And again, for our message today, if you choose to use cannabis, please do so responsibly. Never get behind the wheel after using drugs and alcohol, and always plan ahead for a sober ride. Because if you feel different, you drive different. So educate yourself, be responsible, and by doing so, you can help keep all motorists on our highways safe. Thank you, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Colonel Matt Langer. Colonel Langer.
Thanks, Commissioner. My name is Matt Langer, and I have the honor and privilege of serving as Chief of the Minnesota State Patrol. So a week from today, recreational cannabis use will become legal in Minnesota for anyone 21 years of age or older. This is a big change for our state in a variety of areas, but when it comes to traffic safety, it will never change our commitment to keep people safe on our roads. That is, in fact, the mission of the Minnesota State Patrol. We want to get word out to drivers to not get behind the wheel if they choose to use cannabis or any other impairing substance. Driving while impaired often has devastating consequences. Unfortunately, drug driving is not new. Our troopers and law enforcement officers across the state have been recognizing a steady increase in drug driving cases over the past several years, including impairment from multiple substances at the same time, including alcohol. Drug driving accounts for just under 7,000 DWI incidents from a period of time between 2012 and 2016, compared with just under 16,000 incidents from 2017 to 2021. The comparison across those two identical periods of time represents a 127% increase in drug driving on Minnesota's roads. Here's what safety looks like to make sure impaired driving doesn't result in a tragedy. First, our troopers and most licensed peace officers are trained on standardized field sobriety testing protocol. They're trained to look for cues of impairment from alcohol to drugs or a combination of both. They look for things such as body tremors, failure to control speech, manner of speech, change in pupil size, bloodshot, watery eyes, and a host of other effects. In addition, if they do suspect drug impairment, officers have the option of requesting a drug recognition evaluator to come help with that situation. The DRE can assist with the investigation by performing a scientifically validated evaluation. As a motorist or passenger, there are other critical things to know about the law behind the dangers of driving while impaired, which is enough of a danger in and of itself. First, it's important to remember that while in a vehicle, it's illegal for drivers or passengers to use marijuana or any cannabis products or to have open cannabis packaging. This is similar to the laws around alcohol. You can't have an open bottle of alcohol in your vehicle or drink while you are driving or riding in that vehicle. The same is true with marijuana and cannabis starting next week. Violating any of those rules can lead to you being charged with a traffic offense. You may keep open product in the trunk of a car or another area that is not accessible to any of the occupants in the vehicle, including the driver and passengers. Lastly, if you do choose to partake in cannabis consumption next week when it becomes legal, our message is the same one we've provided for alcohol for many, many years, and we will continue to provide. Plan ahead and never drive while impaired by any substance at all. Thank you, and I'll now introduce Director Hansen from the Office of Traffic Safety.
Thank you, Colonel Langer, and thank you everybody for being here today. My name is Mike Hansen, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director for the Department of Public Safety's Office of Traffic Safety. Most Minnesotans get home safely each and every day because they take the driving task seriously. They buckle up, they pay attention, they obey the speed limit, and if alcohol is involved in their daily activities, they plan ahead and have a safe ride home. As cannabis legalization begins next week, the same simple life-saving choices apply. Impaired is impaired regardless of what the substance used is. If you feel different due to an impairing substance, you're going to drive different. And if you're driving differently, you are probably driving unsafely. Just like with alcohol, if legalized cannabis is going to be part of the mix, then you need to make the right, smart choice. Plan a safe and sober ride home and stick to the plan. There are no excuses to wind up in the backseat of a squad car, an ambulance, or heaven forbid, a hearse. Drug-related impairment on our roads is on the rise, and it's very concerning. Whether it's alcohol, whether it's soon to be legalized cannabis, some prescription drugs, or any other substance that impairs you as a human being, you cannot be behind the wheel when you are under the influence of one of these impairing substances. People need to understand the dangers and the consequences of driving high behind the wheel. And that starts with a robust education and awareness campaign, which this news conference is part of, as well as being backed up by a very strong enforcement program. Let me share a couple of statistics that I pulled up from our research section this morning. So far, as of today, at least 197 Minnesotans have lost their lives in crashes on Minnesota roads. Of that 197, 29 of those fatalities are directly attributed to an alcohol-impaired driver. 21 of those fatalities are directly attributed to a drug-impaired driver. And 13 of those fatalities are attributed to a combination of drugs and alcohol impairing the driver. So we have a problem with that, and we are taking proactive steps to address that. The Office of Traffic Safety coordinates statewide extra DWI enforcement and awareness campaigns at various times during the year. The next big one coming up will cover the Labor Day weekend, which is one of the busiest holiday weekends of the year for impaired driving. This approach includes enforcement, advertising, media, public outreach, traffic safety efforts that we coordinate across many communities in Minnesota. These awareness efforts when it comes to cannabis are already underway, and the advertising includes, as you've heard today, driving high is a DWI. No ifs, ands, or buts about it. The new creative, along with our alcohol messaging, is getting placed on a variety of platforms across the state. The locations include retail locations, bars, restaurants, billboards, social media, radio, streaming TV, audio programming, as well as our many online platforms. Our commitment to keeping Minnesota safe also means enhancing traffic safety capabilities. A couple of examples that were the result of the recently concluded legislative session was substantial funding that was provided to support the statewide drug recognition evaluator program. $10 million in year one and $5 million each year ongoing to support the training, the education, and all of the related expenses to take peace officers and have them enroll in a very difficult but very scientifically scripted training course that allows them to evaluate somebody in a clinical way when they are under the influence of something other than alcohol. Funding was also provided for an oral fluid pilot project. Basically, the oral fluid project is a device that officers may use at roadside to evaluate a driver and confirm that their observations of impairment are the direct result of an impairing substance other than alcohol. It's no different than the roadside alcohol test that is used by peace officers right now, which is known as a preliminary breath test or a PBT. There's a lot of resources going into keeping people safe in Minnesota, but ultimately it comes down to each and every one of us as drivers and as passengers to be responsible and to help everybody make good, smart, safe decisions behind the wheel. That's what will keep Minnesota highways safe for all of us. It's the simplest and most powerful tool for staying safe and staying alive. Drive smart. Thank you. And with that, I would introduce Colonel Rodman Smith with the DNR Enforcement Division. Colonel?
Commissioner Jacobson, Colonel Langer, Director Hansen, thank you. My name is Rodman Smith. I'm the Director of Enforcement at the Department of Natural Resources, where I work with a team of 200 conservation officers that help protect Minnesota's peoples, visitors, and our cherished natural resources. One thing I'd like to talk about to add on what we've already heard today is that driving impaired, whether you're driving in a motor vehicle down I-90 or driving in a boat on a lake or river or driving an ATV or snowmobile on one of the thousands of miles of trails we have in the state, it's all the same. All the rules apply, whether it's a motor vehicle or an ATV or a snowmobile or a watercraft. Back in 2018, a young 8-year-old boy named Alan was killed by an impaired snowmobiler, and at that time the legislature started the process and now changed the laws that all the consequences that happen with a conviction of a DWI in an automotive vehicle apply to your abilities to operate ATVs, snowmobiles, and watercraft. And the same goes the other way. So if you get a impaired driving conviction for a watercraft or an ATV or a snowmobile, it affects your privileges of driving a traditional motor vehicle. So we're fortunate here in the state of Minnesota to have an abundant amount of trails, motorized trails for snowmobiling and ATVing, tens of thousands of lakes and rivers to operate watercraft on, and the important message here is impaired driving is impaired driving. It doesn't matter what type of motor vehicle you're driving. And with that, I guess we'll stand for questions.
All right, thank you. So open up for questions, and if just a reminder, if you just say your name and the organization you're with, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
Talk about smell, odor, and what your troops can do if they stop a driver. My understanding was they're not supposed to use that as evidence of impairment, but it seems kind of, it's gonna be pretty obvious if they pull a driver over. So how does odor play into how you folks operate on the highway?
Yeah, it's a great question, Peter. The question, so I'll repeat it for those that are online, relates to odor and how troopers or peace officers will handle the odor when they encounter it roadside. So a lot of the correlations that we're drawing, and this happened legislatively as well as what we're currently doing, is drawn between cannabis and alcohol. So very similar, if someone stops a vehicle and they either smell alcohol, which can happen if someone has an open bottle and it's dumping in the center console or on the floorboard, or someone smells as though they've been consuming alcohol, it piques the trooper's interest to look further into that situation to figure out if there's either a violation of the open container law or an impairment problem with the driver or both. And so cannabis is very similar, but also is different in some ways. The smell of cannabis can change when it's fresh or versus burnt, and we also have the edible situation. So you can't draw every correlation between alcohol and cannabis as one-to-one or apples to apples, but if troopers encounter a vehicle and it smells like the occupants have been smoking marijuana, you can bet that that trooper is going to be looking further into that situation to see if there's a violation either of the open container law, which includes the prohibition against using any marijuana or cannabis product while in a vehicle, or the driver being impaired.
The smell alone cannot be used as evidence of impairment.
I don't know that I wouldn't agree that the smell alone would indicate impairment, just like the smell alone of alcohol doesn't necessarily mean that someone's been drinking or that they're impaired. But the piquing of the interest of the trooper to look further and be responsible to keep traffic safety at the forefront is exactly what will happen if one smells like alcohol or smells like cannabis or burnt marijuana.
This is a question about the roadside testing hydrant. Will those be used right away, and are people stopped required to take them?
Thank you. Eric's question has to do with the oral fluid pilot project that was authorized this last session. And for the purposes of the pilot project, it is a voluntary participation project. So a driver who is stopped and is in the process of being arrested for a drug-impaired driving violation, at some point in that processing, will be asked if they would be willing to provide a voluntary oral fluid sample that will then be tested and will indicate at some point what category of drug substance may be on board. Again, it's very similar to the way the PBT is used, except the voluntary part of this is it is not admissible in any court action. It is not admissible for any driver's license sanctions. This is simply a data collection exercise as well as an exercise that will help us to evaluate and certify the oral fluid technology that is currently available out there. There's 20 plus or minus other states out there that are currently using it in that screening capability, and that's exactly what we want to do in Minnesota. For the purposes of the pilot project, the units will be issued to the drug recognition evaluators, who are the ones most frequently having contact with a drug-impaired driver, and then we will run this project for about a year. We'll be starting it sometime in September, and then preparing a report and recommendations for the legislature following that initial data collection.
But on the, you mentioned tests, it was my understanding that there really isn't a valid, reliable test.
The technology for the oral fluid testing does exist, and it has been tested and is well accepted, as I said, in 20 plus other states across the country. And I believe one state is actually using it for evidentiary value as well. Again, that's not our goal in Minnesota. We want to use it as a screening test, just like we do the PBT, which tells us that somebody is impaired and that alcohol is what is causing that impairment. The oral fluid roadside test will, based on the officer's observations, they see the signs of impairment. Now they have the device that confirms what their observations have told them.
Maybe a question to the chair and the chair weapon. I'm wondering in terms of production, will the troopers or the law enforcement officers have a scale of some sort when it's kind of not obvious that it is the legal amount for possession of the vehicle?
Yeah, for sure. They need to be able to differentiate between the amount. From a traffic safety perspective, which is, of course, most of the goal of this news conference and the goal of the State Patrol, it's really important to reiterate the open container law when it comes to cannabis in a vehicle, which is different than the quantity of cannabis that you can transport or possess. And our message is to keep that similar to alcohol. We can draw a one-to-one there, is that if you're going to be transporting cannabis in your vehicle starting next week, it can only be transported in the original packaging that is sealed, or if it's open, it has to be transported in the trunk or some place that's well outside the reach of the driver and the passengers. No different than how you would transport a half-open bottle of alcohol today.
It's Eric from Channel 5 again. In light of the Red Lake Nation opening their sales August 1st, is that changing the approach
The plain answer, the question relates to, are we doing anything different with Red Lake Nation, which is one of the tribal nations that's elected to sell cannabis prior to the state's licensing coming online? The short answer to the question is no. We're not doing anything different with that. The troopers are out and they're vigilant across the entire state of Minnesota for all things impaired driving related, including alcohol, including cannabis. They're doing that today, and they'll do that next week just as much as we are today.
Yeah, so the question is, how are we going to navigate or enforce the use of cannabis in a state park? And so we're working through that right now with reading the language, working with our legal team, because the state parks are scattered throughout the state with many local jurisdictions, whether they're in city, townships, counties, and so we're working on trying to find a common approach for all the state parks so there's not a patchwork.
I don't smoke, so I don't know the answer to this. Can I smoke in a state park?
Oh, I don't smoke, so I guess I don't know.
Because right now, my understanding is anywhere that smoking is permitted,
Yes.
marijuana smoking and vaping will be permitted. Unless, I don't know whether you or the agency has the authority to do rulemaking to say by rule, cannabis smoking will not be allowed in state parks.
Yeah, I'd have to get back with you on that. I wasn't prepared for state parks questions this morning. I apologize.
I'm not sure if you want to tackle this. What a DRE would do on the roadside, that a trooper would not be able to do. Talk about sort of scientifically derived methods. Can you, if you know, describe what those are? What is the DRE able to detect that a trooper with some training would not do?
The question is, what will a DRE do at roadside, or how does a DRE come into play in that arrest process? And without getting really too far down in the weeds, the officer makes the stop based on driving conduct, sees signs of impairment, and then determines that that impairment is probably not the result of alcohol. At that time, that law enforcement officer can contact the DRE and either do a phone consultation, or if a DRE is in the area, the DRE can come to the scene of the stop. The DRE typically at the scene of the stop is going to do a couple of other preliminary psychophysical tests and maybe a real brief physical assessment. But the DRE evaluation itself typically takes place off of roadside, because it takes anywhere from 30 to 40, maybe even 50 minutes for that clinical evaluation to take place. And so again, what the DRE is looking at is the physiology of the individual who has been placed under arrest, some of the physical indicators of the different drug categories. Some of them speed us up, some of them slow us down, and then when we start mixing them, the colonel talked about the polydrug or multi-substance, you have all of that factors into it. So it's looking at body temperature, it's looking at blood pressure, it's looking at pupil size, all kinds of things like that. So it's a scientifically validated and internationally accepted protocol that is used by a highly trained law enforcement officer. And many times we talk with prosecutors across the state, and the officers do a really good job documenting the impairment, and then they do the proper procedure to obtain that evidentiary test. But oftentimes that conviction can really be keyed upon the evidence that DRE can bring in based on their experience and their training and their observations of that individual.
Any other questions before we wrap it up? All right. Thank you for coming. Appreciate it.